There are risks and costs to action, but they are far less than the long-range risks of comfortable inaction. Friends, these are the words of former President John F. Kennedy, and while we likely nodded our heads in agreement as we heard them, if we're honest, they also make us a bit uncomfortable. Uncomfortable not because of who said them, and probably not because we don't understand what is being said, but uncomfortable because of that scary word that we'd all much rather avoid: risks. To take a risk is to expose the chance of loss or injury, to take a chance and do something without full certainty of how it will end up. And if we're honest, we don't like taking risks. Even the thought makes some of us immediately turn and run in the other direction. And I get it. There are times in life when I, too, have avoided taking the risk for fear of what might await me. I have avoided the uncomfortable and chosen what I knew I could count on. I have preferred to stay quiet, to stay put and do absolutely nothing, because not being able to predict the outcome of my actions was far too risky. Again, I get it, especially because we are taught to be thoughtful, to consider every possible thing before making any decisions, to avoid the urge to be impulsive, to be responsible, and therefore never reckless. Because to many of us, taking certain risks implies a sort of recklessness. And friends, while I don't think there's anything wrong with being thoughtful, with weighing every option, and even being cautious with our choices, especially since sometimes our rush to action causes more harm than good, I do think there's something wrong when taking our time or proceeding with caution leads us to inaction. Because let's be honest, sometimes we choose not to take the risk because doing so means we relinquish control. And we're not always ready for that. We're a people who thrive off of the security that comes from being in control, and the minute it seems as though we might lose it, we rush to do all that we can to hold on to it for just a little while longer. But here's the thing. There's a world of people out there who've never had the privilege of being in control. They've never had the security that comes from being able to play it safe or even to turn the other way. And if we're serious about what we've been talking about the last few weeks, I think we owe it to them to take the risk despite our fear of feeling or being in control. Because, friends, that's what reckless faith looks like. It's what being a good neighbor, using our privilege for good and loving selflessly looks like. It's when we realize that in the harrowing fight against injustice, where people are losing their lives and disparities are continuing to divide us and hate is continuing to hold us back, that inaction is not an option. In fact, it is because of our faith that we can and should take those risks. You see, we do more harm than good when we choose not to take the risk at all. We lose out on the opportunity to make a difference. We miss being a part of a possible solution. We decide in that moment that our own comfort is more important than the systemic discomfort so many people are victim to in the world around us. So yes, there are risks and costs to action, but they are far less than the long-range risks of comfortable inaction. And so maybe taking risks is reckless. But what if in this case, being reckless is right? Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. And yet other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. There are risks and costs to action, but they are far less than the long-range risks of comfortable inaction. You see, in this very popular passage of Scripture, we find the parable of the sower, a story Jesus told to both the crowds and the disciples. This story, later clarified by Jesus to the disciples, is one that is about spreading the word of the kingdom and the reality that not all will receive it or understand it. A story that tells us a little bit of something about times when taking risks can lead to both unfavorable and favorable circumstances. And today we could focus on the soil, perhaps unpacking what it means to do our best to be good soil, or hearts that truly understand the word and thus forth bring forth much fruit. And we could also focus on the seed, thinking together through what it means to be scattered in unlikely places against our own will, and having to make sense of what it means to try and grow in seemingly dry places. And to be honest, there are moments in life when we find ourselves as both the soil and the seed. But today I'd like us to think about that third possibility, and that's the possibility of us being the sower, the one who is called to go out and essentially do more good, the one tasked to carry the word of the kingdom to various places at various times without certainty of the outcome. And according to our scripture, with all that in mind, a sower still went out to sow. Now, friends, many have argued that in reading this passage, we ought not get too caught up in the metaphor, especially since if you know anything about gardening and farming, the actions of this particular sower appear irresponsible. There seems to be little to no regard for where one sows. And we don't read anything that suggests the sower came back to water, to nurture, and to ensure the growth of each seed. What we do read, however, in spite of all of that, is that a sower went out to sow. In other words, despite the conditions, the fear around not knowing what the results would be, and despite not being able to control the outcome, a sower still went out to sow. You see, it is easy to critique the logistics of this lesson. In an ideal situation, the sower would have been more thoughtful and certainly would have been careful not to sow seed recklessly. But friends, I ask the question again, what if in this case being reckless is right? What if in this case it is right and righteous to just give generously? What if the message of the parable is to embrace what each of us have been called to do? To take seriously the call to go out and do more good in this world, to be intentional about sharing that which you have been given, to love unconditionally, which means to love despite less than ideal circumstances, to decide that it's worth taking the risk, even if it means trusting that only some might bring forth fruit, to be okay with being called to just sow and then trusting the watering, the growing, and the outcome to someone else. Imagine for a moment, friends, if the laborer just decided not to sow at all. If they chose that taking that risk wasn't worth it at all. You see, this sower reminds us that we don't always know, that while we know many things, we don't know everything, and that it is okay to just take the risk, just in case the seed might grow and live. Just in case that letter that you wrote to city officials leads to policy change next year. Just in case that monetary gift that you gave while stuck at a traffic light leads to someone having a meal to eat that day. Just in case holding your family members accountable means they'll decide to pick up a book about racist ideas in America for more understanding. Just in case. Yes, there are risks and costs to action, but they are far less than the long-range risks of comfortable inaction. Of course, there will be times when the letter won't go further than the mailbox, or the monetary gift will be used for something else, or the conversation with family will result in more headache than healing. But what if you choose to do nothing at all? What if you decide that sowing anyway or sowing in spite of isn't really worth it? What if that choice means another 400 years of the same injustices, the same systemic discomfort, and even wider gaps between the haves and the have-nots? What if? You see, I happen to think Jesus told this parable to convince us that the reward is in the risk. That in being courageous enough to sow anyway, despite where the seed may fall, we exercise our faith. That in ignoring the status quo and deciding to be reckless, we put our faith to the test. That in taking the risk, we show we are more committed to being on the right side than we are to being on the wrong side. And friends, I don't know about you, but I want to be on the side where Jesus is most likely to be. And if going out and sharing the word of the kingdom, sowing seeds in the direction of justice, and being thoughtful and active means being on the side of Jesus, then taking the risk will always be worth it. In his very popular book, Jesus and the Disinherited, Howard Thurman asks the heart-wrenching question, what does our religion have to say to the masses of people living with their backs against the wall? He says that the issue is not what it counsels them to do for others whose need may be greater, but what religion offers to meet their own needs. For people grappling with what it means to survive, what does our religion have to say? And friends, if we take seriously the socioeconomic divides and disparities in this nation, we have to admit that much like the seed and the soil in our text, there are many people in this world who have been placed in disparate and unlikely conditions without much chance of survival, let alone thriving. So if we were to grapple with that question of what our religion has to say to the poor, the dispossessed, and the disinherited, we would have to consider what it means to sow anyway. Despite pre-existing conditions that harmfully and disproportionately affect the poor, the dispossessed, and the inherited, to sow anyway. And despite the times where the seed and the soil aren't given much a chance at life, to still sow anyway. That because there exists such a large number of people living with their backs against the wall, that we have a moral obligation, a religious responsibility, and a faithful requirement to sow anyway. And it is because of what Howard Thurman names that we don't have the option to just allow thoughtfulness or caution or fear to stop us from going out and planting those seeds of justice where it might be needed. And if we do so with the thought in mind that in doing what is right, none of us lose, then I think it is easier to adopt a posture of reckless faith. Reckless faith is that willingness to trust God enough that you'll do your part and give generously without the need to control where it lands or how it grows. Reckless faith is what calls us to sow unsparingly and to know that the act of sowing itself is what brings about hope. Hope in what could be, hope in the possibilities, hope. And so, friends, I think if we dared to hope in this way, that we might actually be able to gradually begin to address the systemic issues of that proverbial soil all around us. But we can't get to that until we first confront our own fears around taking risks and giving generously to the cause of justice. So I leave you with this question today. From what is fear holding you back? And as we grapple together with that this week, I want us to then imagine how our fears might be holding someone else back as well. There are risks and costs to action, but they are far less than the long-range risks of comfortable inaction. So friends, with fear and uncertainty, and with the reckless faith we are being called to model, may we choose today to sow anyway. And may we dare to hope together that in doing so, we bring about hope. May it be so. Amen.